Thank you. Thanks. Hi. So quiet. So just a few announcements before we start. I know you'll be very disappointed, but we're not going to have class on Friday. I know. Actually, my policy is usually not to have classes on Friday, but other than in case of an emergency, i.e. material that is really important to get across, but I think we're fine for this Friday. And the next Friday, we will not have class either because our speaker cannot make it. He will be speaking here, though, as part of the Leadership Institute of Harvard College later on in the semester, so look out for his name. The good news is that Scott Snook, who is considered by many, me being one of the many, to be the leading leadership development person in the world, is going to be a guest lecturer here next week. He's at the business school. He's worked for many years at West Point. He's an officer and developing their leadership development curriculum. So he's the person who developed the leadership curriculum for West Point, and he's going to come and talk to us about some of his experiences and at West Point, what he's doing now at the business school teaching, and how we can apply what he has learned over many years that we can apply in our own leadership development. So, phenomenal speaker, very exciting that he'll be here. We are 1 week behind on the readings, so the readings on the vision, which were supposed to be for next week, you don't need to do for now. I'll also email you to do just parts of it for the week after. So if you're already caught up with the reading, it means you have a week off. If you haven't caught up, good opportunity to do so. Also, I'm going to email you this afternoon about the first major exercise in this class. As you know, you're going to start meeting next week for your coaching groups. I'm going to send you some more information about that. But the major exercise, one of the most important things which we'll probably get to talk about on Monday, probably not today, is the 360-degree feedback exercise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to email you with a list of 4 questions to which you're going to add 1 or 2 more questions that you're going to send out to people who know you between extremely well and pretty well. So your parents, if you want, you don't have to. I mean, you'll have a list of choice of people, your parents, siblings, teachers who know you well or pretty well, siblings, coaches, teammates. You're going to send it out to 6 people and get feedback about, it's going to be a sort of an appreciative inquiry about what you thrive at, what you're good at, what your strengths are. It's also going to ask for what you can improve as a leader. It's going to ask for particular questions, and you're going to add a question or 2 of your choice, something that you want to find out that you think will help you become a better leader. 360 degrees feedback, and I'll talk much more about it again probably next time, is the, and Dr. Kennedy spoke about it, is the single most important exercise for coaching. It's how coaching starts, and we're going to start the coaching groups with that exercise. You'll learn a lot from it. So I'm going to send out this email later today, as well as the response paper for next week. A question that was sent to me by Kat Burton about unconditional acceptance. So the question is, unconditional acceptance is a very powerful concept. It can really open up relationships, interpersonal relationships. It can open up relationships at work, leader versus or with the followers. It's a really powerful concept. Remember, we talked about it as being the soil in which the seed is put in, and the soil being the individual who can flourish when there is unconditional acceptance, unconditional positive regard, which is the foundation that Carl Rogers introduced in his person-centered therapy. And we said that this is part of the space, that plus appreciative inquiry is the space in which we're going to develop ourselves and in which we can develop others as well, as leaders, as friends, as partners. The question that Kat asked, which is an important one, is there a limit to unconditional acceptance? What about someone who has done something immoral, harsh? And the answer is, my answer, people have different answers, my answer is that there is a limit to unconditional acceptance. Where that limit is, each one decides for him or herself. So for instance, separating the person from the behavior. I can do that certainly, when my child comes home with a poor report card, I'm going to focus on the behavior. You didn't study hard, as opposed to the person. You're stupid. That's easy, right? And it's important to separate. However, and by the way, also with the positive, when they bring home a great report card, it's not, oh, you're wonderful, you're terrific. It's, you've worked hard, you've earned that A. Focusing on the behavior rather than the person. But what if someone does something immoral? The extreme example, do you unconditionally accept, do you divide between the person and the behavior if someone abuses another person? Oh, it's a terrible thing that you abused, but you're a wonderful human being. More difficult, right? Now, where that boundary is between the person and the behavior is up to you to decide, where you think they've crossed the moral line. There are some people who would say they are unconditionally accepted. It's your choice, where and if you draw the line. I think it's an important question. I just wanted to clarify where I stand on this. So, I want to finish up last week's lecture before we go into leadership cultivation. And remember we talked about appreciative inquiry. And I want to end by talking about the basic assumptions of appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry, the idea of grounded positivity. Again, positivity, focusing on what's good, what works, on the things we're passionate about, on our strengths, on the wonderful things at Harvard, and the wonderful things about me as a leader, wonderful things about my parents, my friends. But it's not detached positivity. It's grounded positivity because it focuses on something that actually happened. So when I asked you to describe an experience at Harvard, it wasn't just invent, what would you like Harvard to look like? Which is important to imagine, to envision, but ideally we want to have it grounded. So I asked you, what has gone well at Harvard? Oh, cultural rhythms was a real great experience for me. Okay, so what can I learn from this positive experience, grounded positivity, and apply to the future? Okay, so I like to interact with different people from different cultures. Or maybe what you derive from that is that I like to lead. I enjoy organizing things. Or the example of, well, I really enjoyed seeing the Dalai Lama. Well, what can I extrapolate from this experience? Well, that I want to make more use of the phenomenal resources here and go to KSG if there are talks, the law school, and make more use of my Harvard experience that way. It's grounded positivity. What can I learn from the past to inspire the present and apply to the future? Let's look at a few of the basic assumptions of appreciative inquiry. The first basic assumption: in every society, organization, or group, or person, something works. No matter how bad an organization is, or a society is, or an individual is feeling, there are always good things, positive things to look at. Nothing is completely, perfectly good, completely, perfectly bad. The question, though, is what do we focus on? See, because the problem is that most good things in the world, we fail to focus on them. And remember, it's like a seed. If we don't put the light on the seed, it will wither and die. If we don't cultivate, if we don't nurture positive experiences, and by that I mean thinking about them, talking about them, writing about them, appreciating them, they will not appreciate. The contrary, they will depreciate. Stavros and Torres in their book say, at its broadest level, appreciative inquiry is about discovering value in people, places, and things. It is about discovering the positive core. A fundamental concept related to appreciative inquiry is that every person, place, and thing has something of value, some worth, some untapped opportunity. One simply has to inquire into it. The book that Stavros and Torres wrote is about appreciative relationships. And they say how important appreciative inquiry is in a relationship. They talk about mostly romantic relationships, but not only. Also about just close personal relationships. Saying if we just focus on the positive core in the other person, appreciate it, cultivate it, nurture it, it will make all the difference. There's a lot of commonality between research in leadership and research in relationships. And for many years, people have asked, what is the common characteristic of great relationships, great interpersonal relationships? And by far, the number one predictor of great relationships has been the partner's willingness, and ability to focus on the positive in the other person, to appreciate the positive. Very often, even more so than the person him or herself does. To see something in that person that is real, grounded, not invented, not imagined, not illusion, it's not an illusion. But to see that something special in the other person, to actively seek it, to appreciate it actively, and to make it flourish and grow. The number one predictor, by far, there's not a close second, of great relationships. Those of you in positive psychology will get much more of this idea when I talk about relationships. But just remember this because it applies very much to leadership. The great leaders are one who are able to see the seed in the person, the potential, and help it grow. A second basic assumption is that what we focus on, what we inquire about, what we appreciate, becomes our reality. Once again, going back to research on relationships. A psychologist by the name of John Gottman is able to predict with 94% accuracy whether a relationship will last or will not last, based on a simple intervention. And that is to ask the partners to tell him about their past, about their first date, they have children, about the birth of their child, the first year, about dinners that they went to together. Based on that, he was able to predict with 94% accuracy whether they'll be married 5 years from now. How? By seeing what they focus on. Do they focus on the positive, or do they focus more on the negative? Now, there are very rarely perfect first dates. In the movies there are. Outside the movies, very rare. No, they're very rarely perfect first years in a marriage. In the movies, maybe there are. In reality, rarely. And the question is, what do we focus on? Again, nothing is perfectly good, nothing is perfectly bad. Do we focus, appreciate, cultivate the positive, or do we do it for the negative? See, the problem with the problem-solving approach, which is the approach of most consultants, the approach of most interventions, whether it's executive training, leadership programs, is that when you focus on the problem, you often accentuate it. You make it grow. Now, this doesn't mean, appreciative inquiry does not mean ignoring the negative. Not at all. But what it's about is shifting the pendulum more toward the positive. instead of just focusing solely on the problems. In her book, Sue Annis Hammond writes, by paying attention to problems, we emphasize and amplify them. And the issue is, and this is why when you have your 360 that you're going to send out this week, it is also going to have a question there, what can he or she do to improve as a leader? But it will also have the question, what is he or she great at? So that we can appreciate also the positive core. Again, it's not about ignoring the negative, it's having that as well. A third basic assumption, a very important one of appreciative inquiry, related to the other two, they're all interconnected, is that what we ask affects our reality, the kind of questions that we ask. Cooper Ritter, the founder, and Whitney, inquiry and change are not separate moments, but are simultaneous. Inquiry is intervention, the seeds of change, the things people think and talk about, the things people discover and learn, and the things that inform dialogue and inspire images of the future are implicit in the very first questions we ask. This is one of the most important skills that you will hopefully develop in this course, the ability to ask questions. In coaching groups, you will be asking a lot of questions. A lot of questions will be asked of you. The mark of a great leader is very often the ability to ask questions, because questions launch us in a certain direction. In your reading this week, at the heart of good executive coaching is the ability to ask provocative questions. It's part of being a beautiful enemy. Joe Badaracco, career housemaster, leadership expert. I've now come to believe, after listening to hundreds of managers discuss difficult decisions of personal and professional responsibility, that the most useful guidance involves asking questions, not giving answers. Learning to ask questions. And the reason why it's important, I mean, that may sound trivial, okay, so asking questions is important. The reason why it's not trivial, because while the espoused theory of most people may be, I want to ask questions, the theory of use of most people, especially leaders, is giving answers. Well, I'm the leader, I'm supposed to know. I mean, how did I get here in the first place? By knowing, by having the answers. And as a leader, the role is to ask questions. These are the most effective leaders. Remember, I mentioned it, I think I mentioned it in the first class, about the most successful leaders in the long run are ones who constantly ask questions. They ask questions of their bosses initially, of their peers, of their employees. Later, they ask questions of their friends, their spouse, their children. They're always asking questions. Again, espoused theory, most people would say, yeah, that's good, I do it. In use, most people think that they should have all the answers. Harvard Business School professor Christopher Bartlett, a colleague of Professor Badaracco, says, if there is a continuum between consulting and coaching, then coaching is much less about providing the answers than it is about asking the right questions. And in the process, helping management find the answers while developing their own skills and personal capabilities. This is the key. When you ask questions, you help the other person develop their own skills and personal capabilities. When you give the answer, maybe they'll take it, maybe not, but very soon it will be discarded in most cases. Now, what kind of questions do we ask? Things like, in your coaching group, so what do you mean when you said that? Or when was an appreciative inquiry question, when was the last time you felt that you really led in an effective manner? Or what if you tried this? You know, it may be out of your comfort zone, but what if you tried it? What did you do well, and what did you learn from your experiences? And the questions that we ask following the appreciative inquiry should mostly focus on the positive, not only, but mostly. Again, Cooper, Ritter, and Whitney. Building and sustaining momentum for change requires large amounts of positive affect and social bonding Things like hope, excitement, inspiration, caring, camaraderie, sense of urgent purpose, and sheer joy in creating something meaningful together. We find that the more positive the question we ask, the more long-lasting and successful the change effort. The major thing a change agent can do that makes a difference is to craft and ask unconditional, positive questions. Now, why is that? Think about the connection between the words emotion and motion. Without emotion, there is no motion. If you don't inspire someone, if you don't get someone to be excited about change, bless you, then you will not be able to sustain this change. Change takes time, a lot of time. And you want this positivity to continuously inspire people. At the same time, also being a beautiful enemy, not forgetting the other side. I think one of the challenges with the appreciative inquiry is that people think, well, we should only ask positive questions, ignore the negative. Not at all. It's there and it's an important part of being a coach and of being a leader, being a beautiful enemy. So to summarize, appreciative inquiry coupled with unconditional acceptance create the space in which we cultivate and help seeds grow. Appreciative inquiry is like the light. Unconditional acceptance is like the fertile soil. And what the light does is focus us on great moments. It focuses on us on great experiences. It focuses on us on what people are passionate about, on positive experiences. And then it takes that from the past, inspires us with the excitement that is necessary for the present to sustain the energy toward a better future. You see, we have most of the answers. And I said also in positive psychology, I'm not going to give you the answers to the happy life or what a good leader is. You have the answers inside you already. The question is also just to find the torch and to say, oh, here it is. Let me appreciate it, make it grow, and implement it in the future. That's what appreciative inquiry is. And the power of appreciative inquiry, as I mentioned last time, is enormous. Just enormous. The kind of success that it had as an intervention is unparalleled compared to any other intervention program. As Cooper Reader writes, what would happen to our change practices if we begin all our work with the positive presumptions that organizations, as centers of human relatedness, are alive with infinite constructive capacity? Take this question and expand it. What would happen to our relationships if we begin it with a positive assumption that there is greatness in the other person? What would happen to our romantic relationships, to our friendships? What would happen to our relationship with our parents? If we start focusing on the wonderful things that they have done for us, that they're doing, the wonderful things about who they are. If we focus it on our in our daily interactions, what would happen to our world? Just imagine the possibilities. And don't just imagine it as something detached. Imagine it based on grounded positivity, on things that actually happened, and applying them to our future and thereby creating a better future. Before I go on, are there any questions about appreciative inquiry or unconditional acceptance? I'm going to shift gears now to leadership cultivation. Any questions? Okay, so let me move on to the idea of leadership cultivation, which in many ways is what this whole class is about. So this lecture is not separate from any of the others, it's related, but it comes at a point when you're just before the beginning of the process, through your coaching groups, the sections where you're going to be doing a lot of the work on leadership cultivation, or cultivating your leadership skills. There's a problem, though, in this field of leadership cultivation, or leadership development, as it's most popularly called. And the problem is that it's still an experiment, this whole field. There are more questions than answers in this field. It's not just me saying it. It's the leading leadership development people in the field who are saying it. People like Scott Sanook, whom you will see next week, and also people like Warren Bennis. Warren Bennis is one of my mentors. I took classes with him. He was a visiting professor at the business school. Probably considered one of the top 3 people today on leadership. And we were at a meeting at the Center for Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School recently. And the Center for Public Leadership, wonderful center, wonderful institution, doing phenomenal work, invited him to help them with their leadership development agenda, with their leadership development curriculum. And we were talking, and Warren Bennis, he was the youngest U.S. officer in World War II. I think he was 20 years old at the time. Today he's 80. A lot of leadership experience, both in practice. He was a president of a university, which is not an easy thing to be. Yeah. No, he said that, really. And so he had a lot of experience in the real world and also teaching it for the past 50 years, on and off. Taught at MIT, taught at Harvard. And we were talking, and he doesn't talk much. He listens a lot, he asks a lot of questions. And then suddenly in one of his contemplative moods, as we were talking about leadership development, he says, and of course the whole room just completely silent, if I were interviewing, and we're talking leadership development, this is what the meeting is about, and this is about an hour and a half into the meeting. If I were interviewed about leadership development today, about leadership on the radio today, I could have talked for 3 days. He could talk for 3 days, believe him. I could talk about leadership traits, leadership characteristics, about the skills that are important for leadership. I could talk about the person versus the situation. I could talk about transactional leadership versus transformational leadership. I could talk forever about it. But if they asked me to talk about leadership development, I don't think I could talk for 10 minutes. That's Warren Bennis saying it. And then he continued saying, when it comes to leadership development, this is a quote, we're still in our diapers. Coming from the scholar on the topic. So there's a problem here. Because if we're in our diapers, then what do we do? Well, what we urgently need is toilet training, right? Urgently. It's a messy business. And we need to experiment. We need to experiment. Is it a problem that we need to experiment? I don't think so. Because, the fact that there isn't much about it, the fact that we need to experiment, the fact that it's a very difficult question, makes it ideal as a leadership challenge for each and every one of us. And I mean each and every one of us, because leadership development doesn't happen from me to you. It happens, as we'll talk about in a minute, from you to you. You're responsible for your leadership development, no one else. And we are going to experiment. And you know what? Experimenting is great. Mahatma Gandhi, autobiography. Look at the subtext. The story of my experiments with truth. If experimenting was good enough for Mahatma Gandhi, it's good enough for us. And that's what we're going to do in the leadership coaching, in the coaching groups, in our sections, and in our conversations. But before we go into the leadership cultivation and what we already do know about it, because we know some things about it, we need to ask first, is it possible? Is it possible to develop as leaders? Or, as the already by now cliched question goes, are leaders born? Because if they're born, then why bother with leadership cultivation? You know, we'll just be frustrated. It's futile. We can study leadership as an academic field. It's interesting. It's beautiful, nice research, but nothing beyond it. So are leaders born? Well, my answer to that, as you can imagine, is no. And the reason that my answer is an emphatic no is because leadership is a skill. And like every skill, it can be developed. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a certain capacity for that skill, a certain talent for that skill. But that talent, that capacity, that potential, all that it does is define a range. It doesn't define that we'll be right here. It defines that we'll be somewhere between here and here. And that range is huge. Let's take another example. The example of sports, basketball. Are great basketball players born? Or are they made? Well, take the best. Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan. Arguably the two greatest basketball players, certainly over the last 20 years. Were they born the way they were? So if Jordan was born and said, I'm destined to be the greatest basketball player of all time, would he become the greatest basketball player of all time? Of course not. He was born with a range. You know, his range was more probably than any other person here, but he cultivated that ability, these talents. And he worked actually harder than anyone else. Any other player. Kobe Bryant, an extremely hard worker. Yeah, surely talented. Surely has the born capacity to be a great player. The same with leadership. Mandela, certainly great capacity to be a great leader. But if Mandela was born and said, you know, I have this capacity and I could potentially liberate South Africa, would it happen? Of course not. A range was defined. Now I'll talk about next time that in leadership the range is even greater than it is in basketball. So in basketball, you know, there's nothing one can do about one's height, but there's a lot one can do about one's percentages from the free throw line by practicing hours upon hours upon hours. So there are certain things that you can do nothing about, but there are many things that you can cultivate. You know, the same with leadership. Maybe not everyone can develop, I don't know, Mandela's very resonant voice or Churchill's wit. But there are many things that one can work on in becoming a better leader. And whether one thinks that one can be a better leader or that one is simply born one way or the other has implications. Bruce Volio from Gallup Organization from the University of Nebraska writes, if you truly believe leaders are born to lead, you may avoid engaging in situations and experiences that trigger your full leadership potential. You may even engage in those situations and experiences, but fail to derive the deep meaning from those events that can enhance your leadership development. Your beliefs about leadership can become self-fulfilling and self-limiting. If we believe either explicitly or implicitly that leaders are born, we're less likely to improve and grow as leaders. It has implications. There's interesting research on this topic in a skill which is decision-making skill, certainly related to leadership. Leaders, it's important for them to make good decisions. They randomly divided a group of people into two groups. To the first group, they told them they read an article, the decision-making skills you're born with it. In other words, they're stable. They don't really change much over time. The other group was told that decision-making skills are acquired. And they read a very convincing article about that, about one or the other. And then they had to actually carry out a decision-making task, where they had to match people with certain skills with jobs that had certain requirements. And the task was purposely made a very difficult task. They started off at the same place. But very quickly, those who thought the decision skills are stable very quickly lost motivation. Their belief in the employees that they were matching were lowered. They became frustrated with the employees whose skills they were supposed to match. They didn't believe they could do well. They even suggested that they should be fired because they didn't match the kind of skills that the organization was looking for. Their decision-making skills actually suffered over time when they faced a challenge. In stark contrast to those who were told that it was an acquired characteristic. Those who thought it was acquired believed in the employees, had faith in them, were able to motivate and inspire them, and their actual analytical skills over the duration of the exercise improved. Belief, a self-fulfilling prophecy. A lot of these beliefs are implicit. Back there, we don't even think about them. But they have real implications. Okay, so leaders are not born. But first of all, what is this appeal with leadership born? There is an appeal to it. One, why do so many people believe it? One is because what we see when we see great leaders, we see the end version, the completed leader. We see the product. We see the Mandela standing in front, in 1994, in front of a free South Africa. We see Churchill delivering a speech. We see Anita Roddick inspiring thousands and millions of women around the world through the Body Shop. That's what we see. What we don't see is how they got there. The path that they took, the failures on their ways, their ups and downs, their struggles, their insecurities. They're overcoming these insecurities, their courage. We don't see these things when we see the completed version on TV. And that's why it's so important to read biographies. Almost every great leader, and there's research on it with US presidents, but almost every great leader voraciously read biographies of other leaders. Why is it important? Because in the biographies, you don't just see that final inauguration speech. You see everything that came before, the ups and downs, the humanity in the process. And then you realize they weren't born Mandela. They weren't born Katharine Graham. They weren't born Rosa Parks. They struggled to get to where they were. If we believe that leaders are born, it exonerates us from the responsibility of actually doing and struggling and developing as leaders, but it also deprives us of the great impact that we can have on our lives and on other people's lives. So if they're not born, are they made? Almost equally destructive to think that they are made. Why? Because it engenders passivity. Made by whom? By a teacher? By a mentor? By my parents? Who are they made by? Who am I made by? One of the key characteristics of great leaders is that they take initiative. They don't wait to be made by others. You can't learn leadership. No one can teach you leadership. Oscar Wilde, education is a remarkable thing, but it is well to remember from time to time that nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. He says it, as a semi-joke, but there is some truth to it. But to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, nothing that is worth knowing can be taught, but everything that is worth knowing, or almost everything that is worth knowing, can be learned. And this is where Janus comes back and says, wait a minute, we have one extreme who says leaders are born, another extreme that says leaders are made. How can I reconcile the two? What's the paradoxical thinking that will help me reconcile born or made? Leaders make themselves. Warren Bennis, in his book on becoming a leader, the one you saw earlier, they all agree, and this is all great leaders that he interviewed, they all agree that leaders are made, not born, and made more by themselves than by any external means. By themselves. All of the leaders I talked with agreed that no one can teach you how to become yourself, to take charge, to express yourself, except you. Great leaders don't only make themselves, they also know that it's about making themselves. And this knowledge then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The question then is, what are you doing here in this class? What am I doing here, standing here, talking to you about leadership development? I just said no one can teach you how to be a leader. I don't know. What are you doing here? Well, the answer is that while leaders can't be made, the conditions can be created for them to develop. The conditions, whether it's appreciative inquiry, whether it's unconditional acceptance, whether it's the coaching groups. A distinction, a very important distinction that Professor Hackman from our department says, he distinguishes conditions from causes. No one can cause you to be a leader, but people can create the right environment for you to make yourself into a leader. And this is our challenge, and this is what we're going to do in this class. All right, so we understand we need to create the right conditions. What can the field of leadership tell us, or the field of leadership development field tell us about these conditions? Do we know a lot about it, or is Warren Bennis right that we can barely talk for 10 minutes on it? Barbara Kellerman, a professor who's going to be a guest lecturer here after spring break, and her colleague Scott Webster from the Center for Public Leadership say, leadership scholars should consider why the gap between theory and practice persists. Why, for example, is there a rather large literature on ethical leadership, but scant or even no evidence that this literature makes much of a difference? Does the divide between what we preach and what we practice say something about the nature of leadership education, i.e. leadership development? If yes, how should leadership teaching and training be changed so as to make it more effective? These are two of the leading people in the field asking this question. Another person who asked this question, and who actually had some answers, is Daniel Goleman. He also wrote Emotional Intelligence. Some of you may be familiar with the book. In his book, Primary Leadership, he says, although studies have shown that real change can result from training, most of the time the change doesn't seem to be sustained, which is why it is often called the honeymoon effect. Considering that more than $60 billion spent in North America alone on training, this is a sobering observation. That's $60 billion in 2001. Today it's much more than that. So how do we prevent, the honeymoon effect? People come out of a class or out of a lecture or out of a workshop really pumped, ready to make a change. And then after a few days, the high goes away and they go back to where they were before. The honeymoon effect. How do we avoid that honeymoon effect so that, we enjoy the honeymoon, critical, but then also have a very happy relationship for the rest of our lives, i.e. we continue to improve and continue to grow and to use what we learned in the class or in the workshop. And that is the challenge that we're facing. The first thing we need to understand before we can answer this question is, so what are we trying to cultivate? What is the $60 billion aimed at? Or more than 60 billion aimed at, and is it aimed at the right thing? Daniel Goleman would say it's emotional intelligence skills. This is what leadership skills are about. What are they? There are things like self-awareness. Know thyself. There are things like levels of empathy. There are things like being able to control our impulses, to be able to act rationally even when all around us lose their heads. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand others, to know others. It's It's the ability to inspire ourselves, to draw passion, and to inspire others. These are the skills that matter for leaders. Now, that doesn't mean that other skills don't matter. Technical skills like the ability to calculate the return on investment, or a cash flow, or IQ, or other technical skills, they matter. But to develop leaders, what matters more is the emotional intelligence. Here is what Goleman has to say about it. While the precise ratio of emotional intelligence to cognitive abilities depends on how each are measured and on the unique demands of a given organization, a rule of thumb holds that emotional intelligence contributes 80 to 90% of the competencies that distinguish outstanding from average leaders, and sometimes more. To be sure, purely cognitive competencies, such as technical expertise, surface in such studies, but often as threshold abilities, the skills people need simply to do an average job. The technical skills, calculating return on investment, being able to use Excel, being able to envision a goal, to set goals. These are important skills that can be learned. But what he's saying is that there are threshold skills. They are the minimum that you need in order to get into a leadership position or a position with responsibility. But what distinguishes the average from the great, from the ones who actually make it and become leaders, are not these threshold capabilities, the technical capabilities. They are the ability for empathy, for self-awareness, self-knowledge, which we're putting a lot of time into in this class. The ability to understand others, which we're going to put a lot of time into in this class. And other emotional intelligence characteristics that we'll discuss that are critical to develop. The problem today, and I'll end with this, the problem today with the $60 billion statistic is that most leadership, 1 minute before you move, that most leadership cultivation or leadership development efforts focus on the technical. They send you to a course and they teach you how better to be able to set goals and strategize better. These are important, but they're not what will make great leaders. The second problem is that those who focus on emotional intelligence don't focus on it in the right way, and we'll talk about the right way next time.